So for Module 2, we want to focus our attention on the event receiver, which is a new scenario in DBXL 2.8. And it's mostly meant for people who would like to use DBXL with SharePoint 2013. In this model, as you can see on the screen, the InfoPath form submits to the SharePoint form library. And the only thing that's installed on the SharePoint site is the event receiver, which is just a WSP file. We're going to see that later on today. On a separate server, we have DBXL installed. And then SQL Server can be on the same server as DBXL or a separate server as well. And that depends on you. But the model that Qdabra is recommending going forward for SharePoint 2013 is this, with SharePoint on one server and DBXL on another server. If you don't have a separate server available, what we can do is create a separate site. So if you recall the integrated scenario that was covered in Module 1, we had DBXL installed on the same site as SharePoint. We looked at the DBXL application pool. We made sure that the identities were the same. So DBXL and SharePoint in the integrated scenario are very tightly coupled, right? They go hand in hand. Whereas in the event receiver scenario, DBXL is on a separate server. And we'll see the benefit of this during this module. So let me remove this slide and dig right into the form. So this is the expense report sample form that has been available in InfoPath since 2007. Comes with a main submit data connection. I'm going to remove that. And all I need to add is a data connection that submits to the form library. But I don't have a form library yet. So let's go to our SharePoint 2013 site and make sure that we have a form library that we can use. And like in the previous module, I'm going to make sure that I name this uniquely just in case different expense report form libraries are created here. We can distinguish them. So that's my form library. I can now add a data connection that submits to it. So this is just an out-of-the-box data connection. I will pick a field from my current schema as my file name. Expense code seems okay in my experience. And that's it. I have my SharePoint library submit. I can make sure that my submit button is using that. It is, and that's it. Everything's set. So I will save this as my event receiver scenario. I'll make sure to save the type as 2013 web browser form. And then I can go through and publish it. And when we tried this during training yesterday, there was an odd publishing issue where I keep getting authenticated. So I'll just go through this publishing wizard to publish to that form library. Okay, so that published. If you remember the training yesterday, we went through this publishing wizard numerous times, and we kept running into the infinite credential prompts. The form wouldn't get published. We investigated this for about a half an hour, and then all of a sudden it started working. So our assumption is that there was a network issue or some server issue. I'm pretty far from the servers, so maybe there was some connectivity issue. But it's resolved anyway, and here the form is published. So we don't need to do anything else with the form at this time. That's all we need to do. So I'll just slide it out of here. And this is our form library. And I'll just submit a document just to make sure that it's all working. So this is just the minimum required information, and there's my new form. Okay. So our form is submitting to the form library. There's nothing fancy there. It's pretty straightforward. Now we need to get the event receiver set up and working so that it can communicate with DBXL. And what I'd like to point out here is that the SharePoint form library is on this URL, training2013formsboard.com. And DBXL, let's just open that up. DBXL is on training.formsboard.com. So these are two separate servers, even though they're on our Formsboard domain. So they're two separate servers. We are effectively going to hop. The event receiver is going to allow the form data to hop from training 2013 to training.formsboard.com. So that's what we're going to set up next. The first thing we need to do is we need to install the event receiver. Because there are various scenarios with DBXL, the event receiver is something that you install separately on your SharePoint server. So you install DBXL on one server, and that's one part of the installation. And then you install the event receiver on the SharePoint server or servers where you want it to be used. So to do that, we need to remote desktop into the server, and this is the server name of training 2013. This is the wrong one. This is training. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm in the wrong one. This is the 2010 site. I need the 2013. So let me load that up. Okay, here we go. So you can see here at the top, training2013.formsboard.com. That's our SharePoint 2013 site. And what I need is simply this little file called Qdabra dbxl.sharepoint.wsp. So it's a WSP file. We're going to install that using the PowerShell. So let's find the SharePoint 2013 PowerShell, run it as administrator. And let's let it load. Okay. So our command here is add -sp solution And then we need the path, which is, let's find out. See, user's desktop. So that's the path to the file, and then we need the name of the file. Okay, it's already installed. Well, that's good. We get a bonus step here on how to uninstall an old version of the event receiver. So this is going to take a moment because it's a two-step process. We first have to uninstall the WSP through this command, uninstall SP solution. And this is going to take a moment to run here. If I try to do anything else now, it's going to give me an error because it's going through this uninstallation in the background. So I'll just get my next command lined up, even though we'll have to wait here a little bit to execute it. So we first uninstall and then remove to get this out of the system. There's a Microsoft command called upgrade SP solution, but we don't recommend that. We've run into some limitations. So for the Qdabra event receiver, we just recommend doing this two-step process: uninstall, remove, and then we'll add it back. So let me try this. Hopefully it's had time to finish. Yes. Oh, it hasn't. Okay. Let's try that again. Okay, so that it worked. So now that it's removed, we can go back to that very first command, add SP solution. So this just goes through and adds this latest WSP file that I have on the desktop. And just like the installation, just like the removal, the installation is also a two-step process. So that's step one. It's just adding it, and here we can install it. Okay, so that's it. The event receiver is now available. So let me get this out of the way so I can show you where we can check that the event receiver is really there. We can go to the site settings. It's working on it. Let's give it a moment here. Nobody's seeing anything. Just a blue screen. Oh, that's strange. Okay, so there's some sharing issue here. Thanks for letting me know. Let me restart the sharing and see what happens. Nothing. Well, let me close the browser window and try that again. Is it showing now? Okay, thank you. Um, so let me unmute somebody. I'm not sure who to unmute, or you can just chat. Did the installation process show on the server, or did we completely miss that in the video? It showed. Okay. Yeah, here it is. So just to summarize, we executed two commands to add the WSP. Add -sp solution and then install -sp solution. So that's the two-step process to add the event receiver. Thanks for letting me know. I'll just remove these comments from the chat. Okay. So our next goal is to check that the event receiver is available to us. Now, you can go to the site contents, site settings, I'm sorry, and let's see if we find it. It's not in the site features, it's in the site collection features. I've run into this a few times. Here we go. Okay, maybe not. There it is. Missed it the first time. So Qdabra DBXL for SharePoint. So this is the key takeaway in this is you're installing the event receiver WSP file on the SharePoint server. That doesn't mean that it's available to everyone, or available to every site, or available to every sub-site. You know, you have to come here and activate it. So you have to specifically click activate here, and that helps you control. Yeah, it's just one more step to help you control where DBXL is getting used and where it shouldn't be getting used at all. So I'll click activate. That's pretty easy. It just labels it here as active. And that's it. So our event receiver is active. Now if we go back to the form library and we check the form library settings, you'll see that there's a new settings page available here called DBXL settings. And this is where we set up the connection between the form library and DBXL. So we need to go through this page. Our next 30 minutes, perhaps 20 minutes, are going to be just going through this page and making sure that everything here is clear. So we'll go step by step here. The DBXL URL is pretty straightforward. We need the URL where DBXL is installed. I have that bookmarked. If you don't have it, it's on the front page of the training site. So that is this URL. So that's easy. Document type name. Document type name is the name of the document type that we have in DAT. We haven't created one yet. This one we have here is the expense report from module 1, which is the integrated scenario. So let me create a new one because we don't have one yet. So we'll call this expense report event receiver. So that's our name right there highlighted in blue. And I'll attach the form that we were just working with, and I'll save, and that's all we need to do here. For now. So we have our DBXL document type, and I'll just get that out of the way because we don't need to do anything else right now. We just needed our doc type name. Okay, conditional submit. Conditional submit is a feature that's going to allow you to only map certain forms to DBXL. So your users could submit 20 forms to the form library, and only 10 of them match the condition that you put here. So those 10 are going to be mapped to DBXL. This is really common for a scenario like a workflow or like a status. So let's say that users are allowed to click submit into the form library in some sort of temporary state, some sort of a not final state. You can call that pending, or you can call it saved, or whatever. And there's a final state that we can call submitted or approved or final or whatever. So you can actually have that condition in here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the form and see what type of condition could we use. So let's say that for the expense report, we don't want anything where the user has not entered items. If the user hasn't entered items, then the total expense is going to be 0. So there's no need to have those in the database, right? If the expense was 0. So let's get that XPath, and let's actually put a condition in there right off the bat. And the condition is going to be that the total has to be greater than 0. The thing to keep in mind here is that the condition is not validated, so DBXL trusts you that you're putting in the correct XPath, that your condition makes sense. You know, you can't use like a number comparison on a text field, let's say, or vice versa. That would get kind of strange. So DBXL is in no way going to check that this condition makes sense. That's up to you. All right, so those are the parameters that determine the connection between DBXL and the form library. These three next parameters are optional. They are just like the name, author, and description that are set up in the first module when we submit it directly to the DBXL web service. So this means you can look at the form, you can pick what is going to be the name of that form, the author, and the XPath. So let's pick the expense code as the name. Let's pick the employee name as the author. And let's pick the purpose as the XPath. These are optional. You don't need to specify these. So let me come back here because there's a question about calculations. Calculations? Can the condition use date comparisons? There are some limitations on what the condition can be, and I believe that dates are no-nos in here. Or maybe I'm getting that confused with the SharePoint mapping conditions. I'm sure we have it documented somewhere. It's just kind of jumbled in my head right now because we have conditions for the SharePoint mapping, and then we have conditions for the event receiver. And I know there are some limitations in each. So I would have to check the documentation to get back to you on that, Michael. But yes, there are some limitations here, and we're aware of those, and we want to address them. Okay, my audio is on and off. Hopefully it's more on than off. If it gets really bad, then flood me with questions, please, to catch my attention. Okay. So then we get to this next setting, which is the Secure Store Application ID, SSO App ID. The SSO app ID is key in this scenario because DBXL is on a separate server than SharePoint. We need something that gives permissions for that hop to happen, and this is what does it. What grants that permission. This is what achieves that link. So we need to stop for a moment on filling out this screen, and we need to make sure that we have an SSO application ID. So let me open Central Administration and show you how to do that. This is taking just a moment to load. Sorry. Okay, maybe more than just a moment. There it goes. So to create the SSO application ID, we can go into Manage Service Applications and then find the Secure Store Service and click Manage in the ribbon. If you have never created this before, you're going to have to generate a new key and go through, and this is going to ask you for a passphrase that you'll have to remember in the future in case you need it. That's already been done. As you can see, this has already been used for other things. So that setup has already been done, but it's pretty straightforward. What I want to do is I want to create a new application ID. So I just click New on the ribbon, and there are a few things to fill out here. We need a target application ID, so let me give this something meaningful like training. That way we know it's ours. Oops, training. And we need a contact email, so I'll just put my own. And we need this to be a group application type because many people are going to be accessing it. And we typically just say no, none on the application page URL. So it's pretty easy. In the next screen, we typically leave this to its default, which is just to use the Windows username and Windows password, and the Windows password gets masked. So we just leave the defaults here and go to the next screen. Okay, so in this screen you have to determine two things. You have to determine who are the administrators of the application. So of course you would add yourself, but in general, if you have somebody else who is going to help you when you're not available, then add that person just to make sure that somebody else is in the system. And then members is what determines who has access to connect to this application. So let's say that you have a domain group. So you could give access only to that domain group, right? So that means anyone who's a member of this group then therefore has access. That's one option. You could obviously give access just to a few people. That's probably not a good way to manage this going forward. You might as well create a domain group, call it DBXL users, and then just put people into that group. Another option, which is what I'm going to do here, is just to add all authenticated users. So what you're saying is if they were able to sign into SharePoint, they authenticated, they signed into SharePoint, then let them submit, let them use this. So I think if you're doing this on 2010, I think it's called all authenticated users, but then in 2013 it's called all Windows users, I think, not sure. But that's the idea here. Now you might wonder, might want to have tighter control here. So maybe you give access to just one specific group, and then you have multiple secure store app IDs, one for each form. So that's one option. Or you can have just wide open, like I'm doing right now, just giving all users access and use that for all your forms. There's an element of how tight do you need your security to be here? How specific do you need your permissions to be? You can use the secure store ID for multiple forms. You can use it for all your forms if you want, or you can use a specific app ID for each form and have really tight permissions controlled that way. So it's up to you how you handle that. The key is coming in this next step. So this next step that we're going to do is really the key here. Is we're going to select that new application ID and we're going to set credentials. So when this app ID performs this hop from the SharePoint server to the DBXL server and authenticates with DBXL, it's going to authenticate using the credentials that I specify in here. So if I put in an account here that doesn't have permissions to DBXL, and I just made one up here just as an example. If this account doesn't have permissions in DBXL, then we have a problem. The submits are going to fail. DBXL is not going to be able to receive that data. So your application ID credentials, whatever credentials you set for your application ID, need to have permissions to DBXL. So what are the options here? And again, this depends. This is highly dependent on your environment. You could create some sort of domain account like I've just specified here. Just call it DBXL user, and you create a password that doesn't expire, and you use that account here, and that's the account that performs the hop between your SharePoint 2013 site and your DBXL site server. So that's one option. If you're testing this like we are now, it's perfectly acceptable to do this. And just, you're the administrator, so just put in your own account, test it this way, make sure it works this way. When the solution is ready for deployment, then you come back here and you reset the credentials and you take that look at how do you want to control permissions, create an account or whatever else. The key is this is what I want to hammer in a way, is this account that I'm using here, I'm also going to add it to DBXL. So I'm going to come to the permissions tab and I'm going to enforce permissions, and I'm going to add it in here. So this is the permissions that I'm granting to the credentials that are used by the SSO application ID. So for now, I'm just giving this add, read, write, and then locking whenever it's opened for edit operation. So So we want to make sure that there's a synergy here, right? The credentials that you're setting here need to have permissions in DBXL. And typically, you can just give the that account document type level permissions, and that's typically good enough. If you need more specific permissions, then maybe we can discuss that offline. But typically, this is good enough for this scenario. And the reason it's usually good enough is because you have form library permissions too. So you can prohibit users from accessing the form library. So they won't even have access to the form. They won't even have access to submit the form if they don't have access to the form library. So typically, doc type level permissions like this are good enough. So I'll save that. Okay. So to summarize, we created the SSO application ID in Central Admin, and we made sure that the credentials are granted DBXL permission. So now we can come back to where we were a few minutes ago on the DBXL settings page and use that as secure store application ID that we just created. This next section is meant for any errors that happen in the connection between DBXL and the SharePoint form library. You can have an email generated to somebody of your liking. So the email would get sent and say, this form could not be submitted because of unauthorized or whatever the error happens to be. So that way, it's a little bit easier to keep track of errors that are happening. You don't have to monitor like the SharePoint logs, for example. And then we have this checkbox called Enable DBXL Submit. This is simply meant for debugging or test purposes. Suppose that you need to turn it off for some reason, then you can uncheck that. But we'll leave it checked, and we'll click OK to get all this saved. And what I'd like to do first is remind you that we had submitted a document initially here, a form initially, and that form is not in DBXL. And I'll show you in the Documents tab. So we have a starting point here where we finished setting up the form library, the DBXL settings in the form library. But now we have documents, we have forms in the form library, and we don't have those in DAT. So to rectify this, all we have to do is go to the DBXL settings page again, and there's a synchronize button. So in our scenario here, we only have one form, but let's suppose that it's a form library that's been used for a long time. You have hundreds of forms. You click synchronize. DBXL grabs all those forms. If there's an error, we typically get a pop-up here. Okay, synchronization complete. So if we refresh in the DBXL admin tool, we should have that one document. Or not. That's interesting. Okay, so maybe something failed. So we can go check. We have a silent failure for some reason. Let's see. Oh, we have a condition. So it's most likely the condition that's causing this. Let's get rid of the condition for now and just use uses the settings without the condition, and we'll add the condition back in a minute and test with it. Okay, so there's our document. So let me go back into the form library and just submit another one, because what we've seen so far is that the synchronize button works, but what I want to show you is that the submitting the form is also going to place that into the DBXL doc type. Okay, so the form was submitted successfully. I go to DAT, refresh, and there's my form. And you can see that the name XPath is getting used for the name here. The author XPath is getting used. The description XPath. So those are settings in our DBXL settings page. So we have the synchronize, we have demonstrated the synchronization, we have demonstrated the real-time submission. So we just need to add our condition back and make sure that that's working. So let me just make sure that's saved, and then I'll synchronize. Now if we were to guess, what's going to happen here is, we still have the two forms in the form library. However, this form doesn't have a total expense, a cost greater than 0. So that condition should stop it from getting into DBXL. So there, it's gone. And now if I make some changes here and resubmit this, now the condition is satisfied. So we refresh in DAT and there's our form. So when the condition is satisfied, the form is mapped. When the condition is not satisfied, the form is not mapped. It's pretty straightforward. And when you click synchronize, DBXL goes through and maps every form in the form library into DBXL. That's the basic scenario. I would like to pause here and make sure that we have a moment for questions. So this is module 3 of Qdabra's DBXL training. The goal of this module is to map your forms data into SQL. Now, it doesn't matter which scenario you have picked so far, whether it's the event receiver or the integrated scenario or any other scenario that is suitable to you. DBXL has a database mapping feature. So in both of these diagrams you see there's an arrow between DBXL and SQL Server. Right here, DBXL SQL Server. So DBXL has this ability to push data out to SQL tables. So that's what we're going to do right now. This is the document type that we worked in our last module. And the tab we really haven't explored so far is the database tab. This is where we set up the database mapping. So the database mapping is the connection between DBXL and SQL. It's not hard-coded in any way. You don't have to create a table that is going to store all of your form data. You can create a table with just a few columns. Maybe a few columns is all you need from your forms. So this, as you'll see in the next few minutes, this database mapping feature is flexible. It allows you to map the data that you need It allows you to modify the database mapping when you need it. It does not create any sort of hard-coded connection between the form and SQL. Now the first thing we need is we need a SQL table, right, to store the data. So I will just come here to our DBXL training table, and I'm just going to create a new table. Alright, so it's pretty straightforward. We're just going to add columns. And as I said, all you want are the columns that you actually need. So don't feel like you need to add a column for every field in your form. So let's say that I want the employee name, and I want the manager name, and I want the expense code, and I want the report date. This is a report date is not going to be in varchar. We need a date, and then we'll use the purpose. So 5 fields, it's a good start to illustrate this. Now the thing is, as you're designing your table, you need to keep in mind your form, and you need to remember that report date is a date, so you need to pick the correct data type. And then of course, some of these data types, I could make them a little bit more specific. It just depends on how you've set this up in your form. So just to illustrate this really quickly, let me come back to the form and go to the properties of the expense code, and I'm going to limit this to 10 characters. So you can only enter expense codes that go up to 10 characters. And I'll save that and I'll let it publish here. And while that's publishing, I'll come back here and I will limit this to 10 characters. So that's what I mean, is you just need to have it in the back of your mind. What did I use as my data types in the form? Those need to match my data types in SQL. There are other pieces of information that you can store here. Information that is automatically generated by DBXL. So I'm just going to put in a couple of more fields here, a couple more columns here, just as an example of the information that DBXL can provide you with. So I will call this created by. And let's say doc ID. It's just an example. There are many more, but these 2 are probably good enough. Now, when you're creating a SQL table, you also need to think about your primary key. You're going to need a column that works as your primary key, otherwise you're going to run into errors when setting this up. So let's use the doc ID as the primary key. The doc ID is automatically generated by DBXL. It's a unique number. Every form you submit has its own unique doc ID. So it's pretty reliable as a key in this context. And you see that when I checked it as a key, it unchecked allow nulls because the key has to have a value. It can't be null. So this is a pretty simple table, just to start off. And I'll call this expense report. So our table is set up. Now we need to set up the DBXL admin tool. The first thing you notice here is that there's a connection string field, and if you asked me to type out the connection string, I would probably fail. What I typically do is I just go get it from somewhere, because when you install DBXL, it comes with this Qt expense report sample. So it's a lot simpler to just come here and copy that, because this is a working connection string. It was verified during installation. So I can come back to my document type and paste that connection string. What I do need to change is the initial catalog, because I'm not mapping into this database. I am mapping into a database called DBXL training. If you've been using DBXL for a while, you'll notice that there's something new here in 2.8. This application name equals Qdabra DBXL. This is for the SQL logs. If you ever need to look through the SQL logs, you can just quickly search for Qdabra DBXL, and it's going to show up as the application name. So that's all that's doing. We can test that connection. The connection was successfully established. We can save that. It's our progress so far. And now we're ready to add our database mapping. Now, the first thing we need to do is to add a table. And once you do that, you're going to get a list of the available tables in this dropdown. So I'll select our expense report table that we just created, and then you notice that there's this green row here called column name with this link add columns. So I can click add columns as many times as I'd like. I think I added 5, and we just go through here and pick our columns, and you'll see that I've already selected created by doc ID and employee name, so those have disappeared from these drop-downs. So I can only map them once each. So I'll just finish going through here. And my last drop-down, I only have the report date left. So that's my SQL table, expense report, and these are the columns in that table. So that's the left-hand side of this mapping. On the right is where we pick the fields from the info path form. When I click this icon, you're going to notice that this schema pops up way on the right. Typically, when you're starting out a new mapping, we just select the root node as the node path for the table. And there has to be a root node here. If there's not, this is going to fail, because all of these node paths afterwards are relative. They're not absolute. So they're relative to this at the top. So then I just go through and I start picking my node paths here. So employee name, we know where that is. We've seen it. It's right here in the employee group, right? So you just double click on it and it adds the node path right here. So you don't have to type it in. So we can go through and add the expense code. The expense code is here. The manager name is in the manager group. The purpose is right here. And then the report date is here. Okay. So we have our node paths that come from the form. We are missing the 2 node paths that don't come from the form, that come from the DBXL web service. So we've been dealing with these nodes under expense report. These are the nodes that come from the form. So I'm going to collapse that, and I'm going to focus your attention on the DBXL mapping tokens here at the top. This is the information that DBXL automatically generates for every form that is submitted. So you have a link, you have a doc ID, the doc type it belongs to, the version number, the ref ID, created by, date created, modified by, date modified. You can use these in your mapping if you would like. So I'm going to use the created by. Oh, put it in the wrong place. So that's the created by, and this is the doc ID. Now, that's pretty straightforward. We have our SQL columns on the left, and we have our XPath on the right. And as you can see, we didn't map every possible field. We only mapped the ones that we absolutely need in SQL. There are two additional columns here in the middle that I haven't talked about. The database type is just the data type for the data that's going to be sent from the info path to SQL. You typically you will typically see that DBXL automatically detects this. Sometimes it doesn't. I've seen it a lot with dates. So you just make sure that you select the right one. And then on the key column, every mapping needs a key. In this case, you'll remember that we designated doc ID as the key. So when we come here into the mapping, DBXL automatically detected that this is the key, and it checked this checkbox because that's the key. So this is a pretty simple mapping. I will save it and I will test it and make sure that so far everything's working the way we expected. You'll remember that we had two documents that we submitted so far. If we switch to the Documents tab, we're going to see them. I'll click Reshred All. Reshred All is going to push that data into SQL. And just to show you that the table is brand new, we haven't added anything. Here's a select statement. The table is empty. So I will click Reshred All. DBXL pushes that data out to SQL. If I re-execute the query in SQL, there's my data. So you see it has the created by alias. Even though I typed in another employee name here, DBXL is still detecting me there. So that's a pretty straightforward database mapping that can be expanded to include more SQL columns, more fields if you needed to. All you would need to do is to make sure that you have additional columns added to your table design, and then you can modify your mapping. So let's suppose that we need an additional column for the, let's see, let's just say the employee email. For some reason the employee email is needed. So we just add it to our table design. If we re-execute this query, you're going to see that that column is null because we haven't had any sort of synchronization there. This column is null because I just didn't type any information. This one's empty because I haven't reached for anything. So let me find my form library and correct this situation. Let's give it a moment while it gets there. So this is our form library. These are the two forms that we had submitted earlier. I'm just going to add some more data and resubmit them. So let's see, we needed a manager name. So we'll just add that information here. And then for the other one, I will add a employee email. So I'm going to execute that query again in SQL. And there's the manager name I added to one of the forms. And the employee email is still blank. And the reason for that is that it's not getting mapped. It's not in here. So we just come here, add a column. We need to refresh the database schema just to force DBXL to realize that there's a new column there. And then we map that employee email. We save it. And you'll see that on this tab, there is a reshred all documents right here. So I just click that. DBXL pushes all the data to SQL, and my employee email is now available. So that's what I meant when I was talking earlier about the flexibility of this. If you're just starting out with a form, you can maybe have a database mapping that is really simple. And maybe after people start using it and they start generating reports, they realize they need some other columns that need to be mapped. And we just saw that it just took us a minute or two to add that additional column. So it's not a development barrier for the future, right? It's pretty easy to come in here and make a change. Now, the database mapping that we've worked with so far is pretty straightforward. What I'd like to do next is make this database mapping a little bit more complex. To do that, what I'm going to do is add a second table. And the reason I'm adding a second table is I'm thinking about the form that we are dealing with. So to remind ourselves of what this form looks like, we've been dealing with the employee, the manager, and then these fields, right? Expense code, purpose. We haven't really dealt with the items. There's a repeating structure here in the form that holds all the individual line items. So what I'd like to do next is I'd like to have a SQL table that holds the individual line items. So, of course, the first thing I need is to generate my table. So let's first store some basic information like the doc ID. And let's see what else we have here. The item date, description, amount. Date, description, and amount. What else can we store? Date, description, amount. I mean, we have category, merchant name. We have other fields here that we could store, but we can store as little or as much as we'd like. Let's add the category to just finish this out. And let's say that for reporting reasons, you also want the employee name in here, and you want the expense code. And let's see, what else did we have? Employee name, expense code. Yeah, I think that's good. So we have 4 columns that are coming from the repeating structure in the items table. We have 1 column that is automatically generated by DBXL, and we have 2 columns that are coming from outside of the items repeating table. So this is a bit more complicated than our first mapping. The final thing that I will add here is a key. So why can't I use the doc ID as a key? I can't because there may be
more than one item per report. So if I have 2 items, 3 items, they all have the same doc ID. They're all part of the same form. So I really need a unique key here. And instead of getting into a form design and trying to add a key in the form and all of that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call this item ID, and I'm going to make it an integer. I'm going to make it a key, and I'm going to let SQL take care of this for us. And the way to do that is just to make it right here, just to make it an identity column. So what this means is this column is just going to count up from 1. That's it. So in this case, so in the first case, our first table, DBXL is in control of this key, right? DBXL is using the doc ID as the key. In this case, we're just going to let SQL take care of that key for us and just auto-increment that column. So I'll call this the items table, and once that's saved, I can come back, not here, I can come back to the database mapping in the AT, and I can click add subtable. And the reason I'm clicking add subtable is because this is the root of the form. And what I am mapping is not the root. What I'm mapping is this repeating node that's hidden in here, the item node. And I'm mapping that into the, well, I need to refresh database again, sorry. I'm mapping that into the items table. Now, this is really important. If you ever have repeating data, the node path has to be the repeating node. If it's not going to work. So that's why I'm selecting here the repeating node. Because we have a relationship here between the expense reports table and the items table, we need a foreign key. You can probably imagine that that's the doc ID, right? As we were talking about, the doc ID is unique for the expense report, but it's not unique for the items. Every expense report may have multiple items, so we're going to use that doc ID as our link here between the 2 tables. And then I'm just going to add the columns. So I will map the amount, I will map the category, date, description, employee name, and expense code. And again, I need to make sure that my data types are selected correctly. And what you'll notice here is that none of the columns was selected as a key. And like I said earlier, that's because in this table, we are letting SQL take care of that. DBXL is not managing the key in that situation. So I'll click the select schema node, and I'll just go through our item group and map the amount, the category, the date, the description, and then when I go to select the employee name, you're going to notice something odd here, and I want to pause and make sure that you read this. It says the path that you are trying to add is not a child of the current parent table. Please manually add the XPath expression. These node paths that we added so far are children of this node path. So DBXL is able to handle that. The relative path between this and this is just my amount. It's just a very direct relative path. The relative path between my item, which is here, and my employee name, which is here, it's a little bit more, it's not as straightforward, I guess. It's not as easy. You have to go up a level, then you have to go up another level, and then you have to go into the my employee group, and then get the my employee name. So the schema tree, the schema tree here on the task pane is not able to dig out that XPath. So we just type it out. So like I said, we need to go up one level to my items, Then we go up another level to my expense report. Then we go into my employee. And then we grab the my name node. And if we try to add the expense code, we're going to have a very similar situation happen. Same message, right? So again, we have to think about we're in the item group, right? We need to move up one level, then up again to my expense report, and then grab the expense code. So in this case, we're going up to items, up to expense report, and then grab the expense code. So I wanted to include two examples of this just to show you the type of manual XPaths that can be entered here in case you ever run into this. So I will save it like this. Now if you remember the previous labs, I probably didn't fill in enough information there to get that data to be meaningful in any way. So let's reshred all and check. I think we're going to have some pretty meaningless data right now. Yeah, so that's somewhat meaningless. We don't have a description on one of them. We don't have a date on either of them. So let's just submit some data. So let me add a date. I'll add 2 items just to show the doc ID being the same. So this is item 1 and this is item 2. And I'll just pick a category and I'll add an amount here, $99. Okay, that's good enough. So that's submitted. Let me come back to SQL and execute my query. So here we have those 2 items. So you see that the doc ID is the same because the 2 items belong to the same expense report. The dates, description, amount, category are mapped appropriately. And then the employee name and the expense code are the same, again, because they belong to the same expense report. So it's the same employee name and it's the same expense code. And then the item ID is just counting up. SQL is just taking care of this on its own. Now, when we talked about SharePoint mapping in Module 1, and we talked about the event receiver in Module 2, we saw that we could control what DBXL was doing through conditions. And it's no different here. So let me add some silly data to this one. For example, let's assume that a user added an expense here and left it blank. It might happen. And I'll click submit. And if I re-execute my query, you're going to see that I have this data here that doesn't really make sense. I have an item with an amount 0, no description, no date, no category, but I am getting the employee name and the expense code and the doc ID. We're getting those from the expense report itself. So this line item right here might cause some issues in reporting, or it might just look ugly in reporting. So how do we prevent that? We can prevent that with a condition. So if we look at our mapping that we are working with right here, we see that we have this node path amount, and this is probably the best one to pivot on because if an item has 0 amount, it's likely that that we don't care. It's likely that accounting doesn't care if the item cost $0. So I'm going to type in a condition here. And the condition is that the amount is not equal to 0. So if my amount is not equal to 0, then we map the data. So let me save that, and hopefully if I've typed that in correctly, reshredding the documents will remove that ugly row from our table. Let's see. Yeah, so it's gone. So if the user wasn't done, for example, they just clicked submit accidentally or prematurely, and then they come back and they finish filling out the form, they're going to be able to get that data into SQL because now it does have an amount. The condition is now satisfied. So there it is. So I'm establishing the parallel here between the condition that we used in the SharePoint mapping in Module 1 and the condition that we used in the event receiver in Module 2 and this condition that we're adding to the database mapping in Module 3. So those are 3 separate locations where you can control which data makes it into SQL, which data makes it into SharePoint, which data makes it through the event receiver. And if it's bad data, you can stop it, right? If it's an amount of 0, you can stop that. Obviously, you can also put in some conditions into the form so that the submit button is disabled, but that's another story. That's InfoPath form design. Now that the data is in DBXL, it's pretty straightforward to make the leap into any other application that needs to use it. For example, let's say we want to generate an Excel report. We can get external data from SQL Server. The server name, what's the server name? I forget. Here's the server name. That's my server name. I'll just go through this Excel wizard. It's pretty straightforward. I am asked to select a database, DBXL training, a table, and I could give it a description, a friendly name, some of these other things, but it's fine for now. Let's put that table up here, and there it is. So there's our SQL data for the expense report, and just to show you an extra step here, let's modify one of these. Let's change that $1 that I had here to $100 or 1,000, better. And I'll resubmit just to show you that if I come back into SQL and perform that query, there's my 1,000. And if I come back to Excel and I click refresh all for the data connections, there's my 1,000. So you could easily just save this report. You could easily just save as, put it in your desktop somewhere or give it to somebody, and it's just a matter of clicking refresh all and getting the latest data. So this ends Module 3, covering database mapping between DBXL and SQL. So this is Module 4 of Qdabra's DBXL training. The goal of this module is to explain the Active Directory web service that is included in every copy of DBXL. So far, what we've used in DBXL are basically 2 things. Number 1 is how do you get the data into DBXL, and then how do you get the data out of DBXL and into SQL. Those are the basic 2 things that we've covered so far. And this next step is different because we're not querying data. We're not pushing data into DBXL. We're not pushing data out of DBXL. We're querying data from your company's Active Directory into your form. So there's a lot of form design in this module. There are two sections or two halves of this module. During the first half, we're just going to walk through the data connections, walk through the Active Directory web service, and make sure it's working in our form. That's the first half of the module. The second half of the module is going to deal with a use case, a real-life scenario that is quite relevant for the Active Directory web service, and that is InfoPath user roles. If you've ever used InfoPath user roles, let me see if I can find that. You'll notice that it's disabled for browser forms. So what this module, what the second half of the module is going to do is we're actually going to simulate user roles through the Active Directory web service. And we're going to control whether controls are read-only, whether buttons are shown or hidden, whether views are shown or hidden according to the person who is logged on. So that's the goal here, long term. But as I said, we'll probably get through the first half of this module today. So the first thing we need is a data connection, right? And we'll just walk through the data connection wizard. We're going to receive data from a web service, from a SOAP web service. And we need the location of the web service. And just to refresh our memories, just in case we don't remember the URL or we don't know the specific name, we can come to the default page for DBXL. And there's a list of web services at the bottom. And here's the Active Directory service. So we can just copy that shortcut so we don't have to try to remember what it is and type it out. So there it is. We just click Next. Now, like many of the other web services within DBXL, within each web service, there are various operations. So what you're seeing now is a list of operations that are available in the Active Directory web service. We're not going to use all of them during this training module. We're going to use a few of them. We have documentation up on the website if you need information on any one of those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a data connection to get user info. And get user info takes one parameter, which is the username of the person that we're trying to find in Active Directory. We don't need to put in anything here because we're just creating the data connection. We're not going to be executing it on load. We're not going to be doing any of that. All right, so this is our first data connection. So what can we do with that? Well, we can detect who the current user is, and if that user is opening this form for the first time, we can assume that that user is the employee that's filling out the information, right? So let's go to the form load rules and start to fill in some of these ideas. So we're going to have an action that says determine current user. We might have a second action that says query for that user's Active Directory information. So that's a two-step process, and maybe the third step is fill in some fields in the form. So using the result of the query, we can fill out some of the fields. So I have my my rule structure here, and we just need to start filling in some of the actions. So determine current user, we have an employee name field, and we have an employee title, employee department, employee ID number, email address. We don't really have a user name, the logon name. So let's actually add that node. So that now we have a username node. We don't necessarily need to display that on the canvas, but I'm going to try to get it displayed if I can. There. Nope, that didn't work. Oh, down here. Okay, here we go. So you might not necessarily want to display it, but I'm just going to display it just for the purposes of this exercise. So what we can do in form load is we can say if that username is blank, we can assume that this is a new form. Right? Nothing has been filled out so far. There's not even a username. So if there's no username, let's find out what the username is. And that's pretty straightforward because InfoPath comes with a function called username. So there's our first rule. We now know what the current user is, who the current user is. And if it's a new form, we're calling that current user the employee. The next step would be to query and obtain that user's Active Directory information. How can we condition this properly? Well, in the same way that we filled in the username only if the username was blank, we can say, well, let's go do this if the employee name is blank. All right, so we're trying to be careful with our conditions so we don't have any rules or queries executing when they're not needed. So we're saying if the employee name is blank, then we should query. But there are two additional observations that I would make here is, in order to query, we need a username. So it makes logical sense for us to say that the username is not blank. Because if we don't have a username, then what are we going to query on? So that's my condition. And in order to get user info, we have to pass a parameter into that data connection. The parameter that we're passing is probably easy for you to guess. We're just passing the username, that employee username. But where does that go? How do we pass in that parameter into the data connection? So we do that through the get user info secondary data connection. Query field. There you see the username. So this is the parameter that we're passing into the Active Directory web service. And we would obviously need to pass in that parameter before the query executes. So I've just moved that rule up, that action up. Okay, so we determined the current user. We found the user. We don't have a name, so we're going to go query for that name. And then we have to fill in some fields in the form. So let's say that we condition this in a similar fashion. So we have a username. Oh, sorry. We have a username, so it's not blank. And we don't have an employee name. So it's a condition that's the same as the above. So if we satisfy that condition, then we can set the value of the employee name. We're going to get that value again out of the get user info secondary data source, but now we're looking at the data fields. The data fields are the hold the result of this query. And more specifically, the AD property table holds this information. The AD property table has various rows with keys, with a key and a value. So each row has a key and a value. How do we know which one to use? Well, we could say experience. You can also go check your Active Directory system and see what the properties are that are available. So I'm just going to fill this out from memory, but I'm going to show you where I'm getting it from. So I know that the key that I want is name, but I'm going to show you a pretty easy way of double checking. So here in my fields task pane, I've expanded my get user info secondary data connection, and you see that I have this table here, Active Directory properties, and I'm just going to drag it into the canvas, and I'm just going to preview that form. And that query is going to bring back a table with every key that's available in Active Directory and every value that corresponds to each of those keys. So that's pretty powerful. This means you don't have to go into a server to check what the keys are. You can just put this table into your canvas, preview, and just get a quick view and find that the name is right here. So let's say that my next rule wants to set the department. So here's a department. Let's say I also want to get an email. Let's see, where's my email? Here's my email. Oh, it's not. Here, mail. Mail. So I have a wealth of information in here, and in my form load rules, right now I'm just setting the name, but I can add anything I want here. So let's say that I want to set the email address. So again, I'm just switching to the get user info data connection, data fields. I will select the value, but I want one specific value. So that's why I pass in the key here. I'm looking for this specific key. And so let's see what else we have here. Department is one that I can fill out as well. And again, we go to the get user info, data fields, select the value, and then filter on the key that we want, which is department. And okay, so we're getting the name from Active Directory, we're getting department from Active Directory, and we're getting email from Active Directory. I don't know that we have an ID number that I can use in our Active Directory, and the username is coming from that username function in InfoPath. So I've already filled out quite a few of these fields, and what I'm going to do is just get rid of this to not have a canvas that's too cluttered, and just preview to make sure that those actions are executing. So there's my name, department, email, and my username. It looks like everything is working as expected. So what's the next logical step? It's, if we can query the employee information on load, the user doesn't have to type in. So let's just prevent them from doing that, right? Let's just make all of this read-only. Because after all, if the information in Active Directory is wrong, then there's nothing the form that can do to fix that. It should be corrected at the Active Directory level, right? So we can just prevent users from manipulating this data. The next section in this form is the manager information, and we can fill out these two fields. using the same procedure that we have used so far. So it's just an extension of the same procedure. And you'll remember that when we started out with the employee section, the first thing we added was a username field because we didn't have the employee username stored anywhere. So we're going to do the same thing for the manager. So we're going to call this manager username. We can go to form load and we can continue our our rules here. So we have to think about, what's the next logical step here. We need a way of determining who the user's manager is. We don't know who the manager is until we actually query for that. So we're going to go find it from the same web service that we queried on our first data connection. But we're going to use a different operation. Oh, and I used the wrong one here. There. So what we want now is get manager alias. So this returns the alias for a user's manager. So that's pretty straightforward. Again, we're not going to automatically retrieve anything, so we just finish out the wizard, and then we're going to have an action here that just gets the manager. Again, our condition here is we want to make our condition smart, so our condition is that we don't have a manager username. So the manager username is blank, but we have a username, an employee username. So once we have this idea for the condition, again, we're just going to query that data connection for get manager alias. But before we can query for get manager alias, we have to pass in that parameter into the query fields of the get manager alias secondary data connection. So we're passing the username of the employee, and this web service is going to return the username of the manager. So the result here, the end result here is that we're going to set the manager username to the result of our get manager alias data connection. Get manager alias result. So it's that straightforward, right? We pass in the parameter of the username, the current username. We query get manager alias, and we get a result back. That's the username of the manager. Let me add that to the canvas. Again, you're not required to do this. I just want to make sure that we can check our work as we go along. So I'll just preview that, make sure that the manager username is coming in. There it is. So we have the employee username as a first step in our form load. Then we query for that user's Active Directory information. Then we start filling out some of the fields in the form using the result of the Active Directory connection. And then we get that user's manager. Now, the next logical step here is, well, if we have the manager username, we can easily go get the manager name and the manager email. All right. So we're making life a little easier on the user, so they don't have to manually type this in every time that they submit an expense report. It's when they open the form, it's automatically populated for them. So after we have the manager,
we can have a new action that queries for the manager info. So again, we need our condition to be relatively smart here. So we want to make sure that we don't have a manager name. So the manager name is blank. But we have to have a manager alias. We don't have a manager alias, and we can't go anywhere. So manager username is not blank. Manager name is blank. So this rule, query for the manager info, is going to follow similar steps to this rule, query for that user. So we're going to set a field value for the get user info data connection. We have this username parameter that we can pass into that data connection. And instead of passing the employee alias, this time we're passing in the manager username. And then we query for that data. And then we're going to have a final action here that's similar to this one. Fill in fields in the form, right? So we have, instead, the difference is that this time it's the manager fields. So again, our condition is smart. This condition would look at whether the manager name is blank. So the manager name is blank, and the manager username is not blank. So I'm splitting out these rules in this very obvious order, right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, just to make things very clear. But if you're designing a form of your own, you might group these differently. I just want to make this as clear as possible. So we have the manager name, we queried for the manager info, and now we need to start setting some fields in the canvas. And we really only have 2 fields to set. We have the manager name, which again we are going to grab from the get user info data connection value, and again we filter that key because we want the name. And the second action here is to set the manager's email. And again, we go to the get user info, data fields, grab that value, and filter it. I think it was mail. And that's it. We're executing 2 data connections, and we're filling in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fields. And we're saving the user from having to type in these 5 fields every time that they open the form. So there they are. There's my name, my department, my email, my manager's name, and my manager's email address. And again, like I said, if you wanted to, you can hide the usernames. Those aren't really needed in the view. I just wanted to make it very obvious that they're getting filled in. And if you had more fields that you needed to fill in, like an address or a state or a country or anything like that, as long as there's a key in your Active Directory system, you can query it using this Active Directory web service. Now, this is a good stopping point. We only have a minute left in the scheduled training, and the next section of the module is going to get deeper into the form design to see how else we can leverage this information. So let's take a moment here.